Today's ILTA webinar, A Safe Landing in the Cloud. I am Marcia, and I'll be serving as your moderator. Our speaker today is John Leverand with RBRO Solutions, and I want to thank RBRO Solutions for sponsoring today's webinar. Today's presentation will run about 45 to 60 minutes, and we ask that you submit all your questions to the QA box, and if those are not answered during the presentation, they will be addressed at the end. Before we start, please know that we're recording today's webinar, and we'll post a link to our website under recording shortly after today's presentation. At the end of the presentation, we ask that you take a few moments to complete the evaluation. And now I'll turn it over to John.
Great, thanks, Marcia. Hi, everyone. We're doing this presentation today as a follow-up to a previous ILTA webinar that we did from our CEO, Howard Russell, on November 1st. Was named Clearing the Fog Around the Move to the Cloud. That presentation was focusing on if you should move to the cloud, some things to look at around the whys, clearing up some information around is the cloud safe, things like that. What we're focusing on today is kind of stepping forward to making an assumption that cloud is in the future for your firm. You're looking forward to moving into there at some point in the hopefully not too far future. So we're going to cover some of the issues around preparing your data before you actually take that step. What the actual move process looks like, and then when you get your data in the cloud, how to manage it and how to maintain the same level of expectations that you have now. So my name is John Leverand. I've been with RBRO Solutions for about 12 years. We are an iManage partner, and we focus exclusively on iManage content, migrations, solutions, support, training. So I've been doing basically all those different departments for this company for a little while now. So I've been well versed with the legal market, corporate legal, professional service firms. Some of you may have interacted with me before. So I'll be taking you through this today. Later on, at the end of our presentation, I'm going to have our services director, Trevor Bell, join us in case there are questions that are a little more technical in nature. I'm going to keep this pretty much on a high level. I'm not going to get too deep into the technical pieces today. Our experiences with moving to the iManage cloud, although a lot of these principles that we're going to discuss are universal. So some things I'll be giving you some general knowledge about what to look for and how to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. So a little more about RBRO. We've done about 10 or 12 cloud migrations so far. Many more are ongoing currently. We're seeing a huge ramp up in cloud migrations. So this is something that the industry appears to have definitely adopted. They're moving this way. People who are just looking at an iManage are going to the cloud initially from no document management system. If you're already on-prem and you're going to cloud, there's a lot of those as well. And other firms who are on some other systems that are looking at making the switch over. We're looking at all those and making sure they have success when they move their content. So let's look at our plan for today. Our flight plan, we're going to talk about a little bit about the cloud and how to get started, then how to prepare your data for takeoff. And we'll look at then actually moving, taking your data, ascending to the cloud, then what life looks like once you've got there. How is everything going to maintain itself, and what's the new normal for maintaining your content in the cloud. Then at the end, we'll take some questions. So we'll hold the questions till the end. If you use the Q&A box for that, we've discussed that. We'll cover your questions, as many as we can, in the time provided. So we're going to start off this webinar with a poll. Just trying to see, you guys can see some information about what your plan is for moving to the cloud, and roughly when is that going to happen, or if it's going to happen, as the last part of it here. If you could have a look at the poll question and click on one of those items there, we'll then share the results on the screen. Just give you a few seconds to click that. Hoping that all the responses are coming in now. There we go. And can we see the results? Okay, there we go. So here's some results. So it looks like pretty much 1 to 2 years or within the year is the high percentage here. More than 2 years, 10%. And the fourth one I threw in there just because I know that's actually a big concern now for some firms that think it's the right way, but not always everybody on your staff is agreeing to that. So that's something that working with partners can hopefully give you some ammunition to enable you to win those people over, to show that moving to the cloud is a good move for your firm for various different reasons that we covered off in previous webinars. If you're needing more ammunition for that, you can speak with one of us or with whoever you're working with in terms of a consulting firm to get your firm to the cloud. Okay, perfect. So we will move on now. So let's get ready, move everything. So I'm going to talk through some scenarios. I'm going to talk about what you need to do to get ready, and then we'll get started here. So hopefully, depending on how you look at this, this could seem really organized, and it could seem like a big mess and a big concern about how to get all your data in order and all the things you have to think about before you actually start, moving things up to a cloud-based document management system. So figuring out planning is key, as always. We're basically looking at a couple different items to make sure you're prepared before we actually start moving. Preparing the content. Do you need to prepare? There's a lot of different considerations around how you're going to be working with this. Choosing the right partner is a key part as well. Many firms will work directly with your solution provider to make your content move up to the cloud. There's various different organizations that can help you out with that. When choosing that, it's good to look at one with a proven record. And make sure one that is familiar and has done cloud migrations. They're very different than a standard migration for just moving your content from into a document management system that's on-prem. So there's a lot of different considerations to look into here. In terms of preparing the content, change management, making sure that it's not something that you keep your users in the dark about. Some people may be looking for doing this, making as minimal impact as possible, just trying to change things in the background, but keeping the front very similar. There is some options and considerations around if you're going to be doing an upgrade at the same time. So from your current version, depending on if you're on one of the later versions of your document management system, or if you're back a few versions, what that's going to look like from the server perspective, that's what you're going probably to the latest and greatest version. The client piece, there's some discussion around that for a lot of firms as to whether they also want to update that or keep the same experience initially until it's stabilized and everybody's making sure that it's business as usual, and then looking at updating to a new experience there. Legacy issues you have in your environment, things that have been plaguing you for a little while. You want to make sure those are highlighted and called out, and you use those in your UAT or test plan for when you actually do move to the cloud. Those are the things you should be checking first. Just because there's version upgrades involved, maybe there was legacy issues with your infrastructure, all that is changing. So you're now bringing this content to a cloud environment that's being managed to a high degree by a cloud services team. So you have to look at and make sure those are taken care of as well. In terms of the specific data prep, some key things that I've got a lot of questions about what you have to do and what should be done with your data before you're actually moving to the cloud. In terms of your architecture, years ago, many firms had regional servers. So they might have had various different servers across your country or across the world because latency was an issue and you didn't always have a really quick connection to get the data. So if you're trying to open a document from a server that's halfway across the world, it was really slow. So you'd have regional servers. That isn't necessarily the case anymore with moving to the cloud. So that's something that we're going to look at is there a reason you still need data split into different libraries or databases? Is that something that you should look at consolidating first? So that's something that you should consider. Maybe work with a solution partner on making that determination. It may not need to go down to one, but the cloud basically is set up for not having to be distributed in amongst different libraries. You'll get a good experience directly with just having a single library. So that's something to consider there. Documents that are not filed appropriately. There's a couple different terms that people use in the industry for this. It could be orphan documents, unfiled documents, documents in the flat space. things like that. You really want to look at getting all your data clean, getting it into the appropriate folders, workspaces, whatever the term is you're using to categorize your data. Making sure it's clean will make sure it's clean when you get up to the cloud. The best process for moving is to basically mirror your content. It's not like you're going to be doing, depends on, so this will be two different scenarios. If you're not already on a document management system or you're on a different system, cleaning up the data, making it straight will be good for migrating it into the cloud. If you already are in a on-prem environment and you're just taking that same on-prem environment to the cloud, such as a lot of iManage customers are doing now, the best way is to basically fix everything in your on-prem environment, then mirror it up to the cloud. So that will cover off a lot of the issues that you'd have, and you don't have to then try to fix things once they've already been migrated to the cloud, because there are different considerations for that. So consolidating, archiving. If you've been in practice for a long time and have a large number of documents, you may want to look at those and see, are these all still relevant? Do we need to bring them all up? A key issue or concern, I guess, with the cloud is that there's no such thing as less expensive storage. Right now, some firms may have an active library, which all their active content is on. That's on your fastest disks. It's high maintenance. You have a lot of backups going on for that. So this is your core data. And when that gets really large, you start archiving to less expensive, less critical storage. So thinking about that, if that's going to the cloud, do you need to bring all of it or just part of it? And again, thinking that through and planning that. Typically, when you see cloud migrations, it's charged by the total amount of storage used. So it's whether that's millions and millions of documents that are really small or lesser documents that are really large. It's total storage used, and it's all the same type of storage. There's no less expensive one there. So that's a big consideration. So preparing your data, making sure it's all clean. Depending on if again, for firms that are already on a document management system and have designed that many years ago, taking a look at your design and seeing if it's still relevant, specifically around the metadata fields. Many firms have their content matched to their practice or time and billing system. So making sure that the data coming over is still relevant, all the fields you're collecting and using to generate your content is still up to date, and making those changes first. Generally speaking, you have a lot more control over the back-end side of things when you have it on-prem and when you're looking at it first, because when you go to the cloud, there are certain restrictions. Usually they come welcomed because you don't want to have to be doing things like Windows updates and maintenance and figuring out why your indexer stopped working. That's all the problem of the cloud service provider now. And they have SLAs to make sure that you have a good experience. So fixing things first, when you want to get your own hands on SQL and things like that, it's a lot easier to do it before you move it. Looking to see what is next. We talked briefly about the client experience. Do you want to keep it exactly the same? Do you want to basically make this just a back-end change to change it around and hopefully nobody notices the difference? Or is it something where you're trying to impress your users with the new version and show them some new features and functionality that likely the new version of the server will allow you to do? So that's something that's to be considered as well. And that's something that you don't always have to do in one step. You can do it as a two-step process to initially get the server, get the cloud server set up, point your existing clients to that cloud server, and then maybe do some trials as to see what are the new features and functionality, and should we move everybody, or is this something where only certain people or certain departments might want to use? With that, you can go into this really deep conversation about authentication methods. Do you want to use single sign-on? A lot of times this is opening up mobility options where you'd have your document management system available on mobile devices, on web browsers, things like that. So that's something that's a whole other conversation to look at the structure and security. Just understanding the security nature of how that works is something to consider. Is there standards for your firm? If you're handling bank data, things like that, there are certain restrictions around certain data being in the cloud. Possibly requiring a local backup of that. I've heard of some organizations saying you can have your data in the cloud, that's fine, as long as you have a local copy of it somewhere as well. So we'll talk about some possible solutions to that, so that you don't have to stay back from the cloud just because of that one requirement. Making sure compatibility for third-party integrations is a key thing. Not all products are compatible once you move to the cloud. typically you're going to run into issues where there's a requirement for access to databases and the actual file store. So where you might have local access, you'd have an admin account that can see all this. You can run SQL queries. That's typically not the case when you move to the cloud. I know for the iManage cloud specifically, that is not. So there's some strategies for looking at what you're looking, how you're able to manage that going forward. I'll discuss that in the third section. We talk about life in the cloud. Before you even start moving, it's good to think about what you're going to test for. Again, with the two scenarios about whether you want to make a big change for your end users or you want to do it all as a server piece, you need to test to make sure that it's a big change going from a server that's sitting possibly, you know, in your own office to something that's sitting in the cloud. There are some considerations to look at to make sure that you're testing for success. So looking at, you know, how long it takes to open a document, things like that. Having a full plan to make sure that, you know, when you're afforded this time to do some testing, what that looks like, what your test plan is going to be, and how you are able to do that. So a big thing that you see is you first get access to the cloud. You want to run some testing and some training against it. How is that data going to be staged? If you're going to be testing, creating documents, creating versions, uploading files, what's going to happen with that data? Is that what you want to keep going forward, or do you want to roll that back somehow? And is there an easy way to do that? So that's something where you can lean on the solution consultant working with you to make sure that the testing that you want, you're able to do, because there are some restrictions where not every implementation can have all those options. Looking at Exchange, if you're going to externalize that as well, for those of you who haven't already moved Exchange to an online model, that might be something you want to do in concert with this cloud migration. So that's just a key item to look at. It's not required, but it does make things a little easier. And then looking at just generally your users list. A lot of firms just simply deactivate users that have left the firm, and that list might be very long right now. So just looking to see if that's something you want to keep. A lot of times for legacy reasons and for search, you want to keep those user IDs around so that if you want to find somebody who authored a document 7 years ago that left, can you still search for that? And is that kind of tying into the first part of your archive solution? If you're going to clean up all data that's over 7 years old, do you need to keep an ID that's 10 years old? So things like that, just looking at it, making sure that it's keeping into consideration. So that is timing. Let's look at timing here. How long will it take? That's overall for your plan to see, well, what is this end to end? If we start planning now, a lot of times the prep you should look at doing before you even start into the project. There's some little things that we mentioned at the beginning there that you can clean up anytime. It'll probably serve you well to have a clean system just running day to day. And then when you start actually figuring out, you know, when do we start transferring the data, all that, you're ready to go. So look at that now, look at it early. If you have a deadline or a time frame that you're being told to, we'd like to move to the cloud by the end of the year, back that up as quick as you can to start looking at some of these items that we discussed so that you're not having to rush, do a cleanup and, you know, be forced into a time crunch. What else here? Design, move everything, UAT. I think we covered off all this. So that's a lot of things that we look at for the preparation are making sure you're setting yourself up for success and really looking at a good understanding of where you are now and what's going to change when you start moving into the cloud. So if you have questions about this, write them down in the Q&A. I'm going to move on to the next section now, takeoff and ascent. We're actually going to discuss taking your data, moving, how that physically comes from your site now in either a document management system or in another document management system or possibly on-prem or just sitting in a file store, how that gets to the cloud and what's the process around that. So we're going to perform some cross checks and taxi your data to the runway. So you want to make sure that you're not in this endless prep cycle and you never actually get to move because of various different things. So hopefully if you've done the planning in the first section, you'll be set up for success in the second part here. You want to remain controlled despite any bumps along the way. So you want to basically be able to minimize the downtime. So when you're actually moving your data, this is where you have a clear plan about how it's going to move. If you have a large amount of data, let's say over 2 terabytes, typically you don't want to really upload that through a web connection or a secure FTP. It's going to take too long. You're probably going to sit there for days and days while it's trying to upload, and your margin of success, there's less of it because it's just a sheer volume of data. So a lot of times, if you have a large amount of data, again, 2 terabytes is kind of a number that we've seen as the line drawn in the sand for. If it's below that, it's manageable. You can likely sync it directly without having to ship disks. But over that, you typically want to look at doing some kind of shipment to the data center. And that's something that that people who have worked with cloud migrations will be able to assist you with. So downtime around that as well. As soon as you take that copy of the data from your system, it's already out of date. You don't want to have a large amount of downtime where you tell your firm, this whole weekend we're going to be down because we're upgrading. So you want to try to minimize that as much as possible. You take this data shipment, understand that it is out of date as soon as you do it, but the bulk of the documents probably won't be changed. So that happens in the background while people are still using the system, and that's okay. A lot of the time there will be a method for you to sync that data once it's been brought up to the cloud, but that initial chunk is probably the biggest piece that you're going to be moving the data. Then looking at that afterwards. This will vary from firm to firm on your test plan, how much data you have, how many libraries you have, but basically you're looking at how often do you want to resync that data and what happens during that sync process. So this is likely during your testing period. So you've taken your initial set of data, they've staged it up in the cloud, they've set it all up, so you're now ready to access it. You can start testing, you can get your trainers involved, them looking at the system. If you're doing a change to the end user experience, they're going to want to look at that, what's changed, making sure that things are the same, or if not better than they are now. So in doing that, you figure out, do I need to transfer the data 2 times, 3 times? From what I've heard from talking with the cloud services team and from clients, it's usually without just going directly to, I guess for the iManage Cloud, with what our experience is here, it's around 3 times. And each of those times have to be scheduled to make sure that the cloud services team is available. And each of the times you have to do something physical on your site to export the data. And there are risks sometimes when you sort of export this data and you put it up in the cloud. Any changes you've made in that cloud experience are typically overridden because you're now updating it with exactly what you've got from your on-prem environment. So there's challenges in that as well you should look at. So figuring out if there's easier ways to do this. There are solutions coming up on the market right now to help with this synchronization. So that's something we could look at as well to make sure to take some of the pain out of this and to figure out if you can reduce the number of actual physical data transfers. So that's something that we've been working with our clients on for quite a while now. So some constraints on migrating the data. Looking at the format of the data, is it something that's easy to move? Are there version compatibilities you have to look at? Is there an upgrade involved in this actual movement of the data? Depending on if you're on an older version of a system or if you're migrating directly into to your document management system for the first time, looking at that, understanding if there's an upgrade involved, that may play into this as well. So the scheduling as well, making sure that, if you have a time frame that you have set up that involves different dates for moving the content, is that flexible? And is it something that you are dictating or is available for just the cloud services team or them to dictate when that's going to happen and how that's going to look? You don't always have to migrate on a weekend. That's a key thing. If you've got some solutions and people that are used to doing this, that have proven processes, it's possible to do this on a Tuesday night because you've already got the bulk of the data sitting there. It's just that small sync, depending on the last time that you've synchronized, that needs to actually move. And you've already got some predictability about where the content is, making sure that it looks good. And you just need to now just sync what's changed since the last time you've moved it. So it brings that kind of big bang and all that stress out of one weekend that you'd see on typical migrations. It eliminates all that. So you can have this going a lot sooner and with a lot less stress. So the testing. So this is where you can see there's a lot of different ways and a lot of firms have different requirements around this. In some cases, they'll want to do some basic IT testing where they're seeing physically, does this actually work? If I click on a document that's 2 megs, is it a reasonable time it takes to download? So there's basic usability testing that some firms do just to see if it's a viable solution, if it's comparable to their experience. Then you'd look at the actual users themselves, getting your staff to look at their own processes, testing those out, making sure that it's the same, if not a better experience. So sometimes there's 2 phases of testing. Again, managing the data. What does that actually look like? Can you roll back information in the cloud once it's there? Are there solutions to help you do that? These are all considerations that you should really plan carefully for, because you're making a big investment here and changing the way that your firm works, taking some of the preparation, some of the planning, and the responsibility of managing this data and handing it off to someone else. So you want to make sure that if you're responsible for this change, that you're looking good in this process and that you've tested and make sure that it meets your specs. Issues, mentioned that as well, making sure that if during this testing you found any issues, you're able to work with your team and your solution provider to assist you in making sure those get fixed. You don't want to run into a critical issue and have no way to fix it. So that's something that is something that you really need to make sure you know who's responsible for it, whether it's something that you can work with your solution provider, the cloud services team, or in some cases, if there's anything around data cleanup that your team might be able to assist with, figuring out what those are and early as possible so that you don't come up with something. If you're testing one day and expect to go live the next, you probably need some time in the middle to resolve issues that you should plan for as well. So it's that planning phase to figure out, we're going to test, then we're going to have a week just to fix issues possibly, and then we're going to go forward. From what we've seen, typically, once the data gets into the cloud, in our experience, there's been very little issues with it once it's there. In some cases, if there's different versions, there's different products, different types of content that you're migrating, that's where you might see the challenge, which is good that it comes up front and you have some time to resolve it. But once it's in the cloud, in our experience with iManage, it's been very solid and very predictable. So the go live process, touched briefly on that. When is that going to happen? Is that something you want to mark that in the calendar and work back from? Or is it something you want to start your testing, see how it goes, and then set that date? Who's in control of that date? Is it something that you can set yourselves? What you don't want to have happen is have a date dictated to you and a Monday go live and have a big closing that weekend. So that's something that nobody wants to have to deal with, where you have something critical going on in your organization and you can't change something. So being in control is a key part of this, making sure that it's happening on your schedule and that you have the ability to set that. So that's something you should ask up front when working with someone who's helping you migrate to the cloud, to make sure that these dates are flexible and you have some control over that. So I think that covers off how the data gets moved. I didn't mention for smaller firms or for smaller sets of data, I shouldn't use that small firm. I think people referring to that now are using the term regional firm. We can look at how you don't even need to ship data at all. If you have less than typically 2 terabytes of data, that's a reasonable amount of content that can be shipped directly to the cloud through the internet. So there's processes where you can sync that content, where you don't have to worry about doing these backups, backing up your file store and your database, shipping it, and then having it stood up and then managed in there. There are ways where you can just turn on a syncing solution where it has your connection to your on-prem system and then the cloud, and then it just synchronizes the data in the background while people are still working. So that type of solution is available, and it makes it a lot easier for firms who have a smaller set of data to go. And then you can have an endless number of synchronizations, or have it continuously synchronized so that whatever you do on-prem is synced in the cloud. So you have some control over what that experience looks like. So now we've talked about planning, talked about moving. Say everything gets up there and you're successful. You have all your data in the cloud. Now you're working with the system, and you have to look at what the new reality is. So now everything's up there. You still have systems that are on-prem in some cases. You have other cloud environments that you might need to interact with. How does that happen? How does that get maintained? And how can your firm stay successful during this process and with your new reality of your cloud-based content? So we're going to look at avoiding obstacles and maintaining connectivity with the ground. So looking at troubleshooting and reporting without SQL access. So a lot of you technical people, at least on the call here, will understand that you need to get into SQL to do sometimes troubleshooting, sometimes special requests. You have a set of tools that you've made to go through and be able to troubleshoot and look into the environment, and you like that kind of access. Typically, with the iManage Cloud, at least, that type of access isn't allowed, because they're making sure that nobody gets in there and changes something that affects your whole system, because they're now on the hook for fixing it. So there's some solutions out there as well to look at syncing that content back locally. So if you want to do some reporting, maybe having a daily sync of your cloud data could assist with that from a database perspective and from a content perspective. Some of you may think that's kind of going backwards. You've just spent all this time and money to organize your data, get it up in the cloud so it's somebody else's responsibility, and now you want to look at bringing it back. So there's certain realities where some firms just like to have that content. And I mentioned earlier, there's some regulations around that where some firms need to have physical control of their content. Some firms just like to have that peace of mind that someone isn't, you don't have to manage a third party in giving you your data back if for whatever reason you want to bring your data back out of that cloud environment. So there's some solutions out there that we've helped firms with to be able to synchronize some of that data or all of that data back down into various different environments so that you can have access to it. Same thing with maintaining connectivity with other cloud systems, making sure that you've looked at how other systems that you've worked with to see, are they going to be able to now take a URL for your iManage server, so that any direct integrations you have, anything that needs SQL access, looking at how that's going to work once you've moved your data to the cloud. If you've planned out for that and you've kind of seen that, they do mention that they have connectivity with your cloud provider, or if you're looking at, keeping that data synchronized locally, how that's going to maintain itself and what that's going to look like to make sure that there's no surprises when you start, pull the switch to move up there and then suddenly certain things stop working. So it's having a good test plan again, making sure that you've tested all the systems that interact with your content to make sure that everything's taken care of and it's all checked. Disaster recovery and high availability disaster recovery. Those two things tend to get lumped together, even though they are very different. A lot of cloud service providers will take care of all of that. A lot of times you'll see, depending on, with iManage at least, they'll give you a primary data center that your data is stored in, and they'll give you a backup data center that's in a different physical location, just in case of large issues. Making sure that that's in place, understanding where that is. This is where some regional issues with data retention, data residency come in place. So understanding, if you have requirements around data either being in your own country or not being in other countries, understanding that and making sure that your primary and your backup server are in that. A specific thing with iManage, especially on the share product, understanding that is stored on a separate server. It's not necessarily in the exact same data center as your cloud data, and just having that conversation, understanding that there could be some places where it's not able to be in the same place. Just keeping that as a question to ask. For DR, so understanding what that means. There's typically, you're given an SLA about uptime. There's plans for failover. There's certain types of quality assurances. So there's different acronyms like TOUs and things like that, where you were given this time frame where if you have an outage of more than this time, it automatically fails over. What that process looks like, if it's seamless for you, or if there's anything you have to do on your end to repoint DNSs, things like that. Most of them have that taken care of, but it depends on your integrations as well. If the URL that you're accessing the cloud from doesn't change at all, it's just a change on the background cloud server, then you're covered. Good thing to test that, to make sure that that's something that's included as well, and to look at failing over and failing back and what the total time might be in between where your users don't have any access. And then looking to see, is there any other, if during that process, say there's a 2-hour window that's expected that you're allowed to have, no access, what can you do if there's something critical during that time? do you have any local copies of that content that you could use in a critical situation? Well, it's planning for that, understanding what that means, updating your DR plans, or your contingency plans. Those are probably quite involved, and a lot of that you can hopefully write off as saying no longer your problem, and just making sure that that's up to date. Talk briefly about retention and archive before, typically about what you want to do before you're bringing your data into the cloud to make sure that all your data is relevant. It's also applicable going forward. All your content is going up into the cloud. It's growing at an exponential rate. We've seen that email is now seemed to be taking over as being the most popular type of file that's stored in common document management systems. So looking at that growth for the future, if you're allocated a certain amount of space now and you're growing at maybe 10 to 15% per year, how long is it going to be for you to exceed that total allocation? And what do those overage charges look like when you get larger? So it's understanding that. And then again, the retention policy. From the firms I've talked to in terms of, how long do we have to keep a document before it's destroyed? There isn't a clear message from everybody that is consistently used and everybody agrees on. So there comes up with this strategy of defensible deletion. If your firm has a policy, typically it's by practice area or by department. You set that up, making sure that you can apply that in the cloud as well. So if you keep documents for 7 years and then you archive them somewhere, what's the strategy for that? Can you easily get the content out of your cloud provider and into a secondary piece of storage, whether that's on-prem or maybe in another cloud solution? Is that possible? What does that look like? Or are we going to be looking at this ever-increasing size restriction where your bill just gets bigger and bigger as time goes on? So planning for that as well. And back to that same plan, where there isn't usually a cheaper option for online storage where you can have it on slower hard drives that are less expensive. Then looking at upgrades. How is that included? For iManage, is that something that you have now? You have the control of saying, oh, it's now, we're on version 10.2, 10.3 is coming out. What happens with the next one? How does that work? What's involved from us? Do I get to pick the date? With other solutions, if you're looking at other cloud providers, do they just pick a date that they're upgrading something and tell you what weekend they're going, and hopefully you have nothing critical going on? So it's examining that as well, figuring out what that looks like. Is there an easy way to update your clients? There's some automated methods coming online from iManage where you can have them roll out an update to your client if you want to do that, or is that something that you still want to manage? So there's new changes coming around with this based on the clients that you have and that you're moving to. Development environments is a big question. A lot of firms, when you're testing your own internal software, when you're looking at going to new versions of software, how do you test that first without affecting your live environment? So in some cases, you can get a development environment separately in the cloud. Is that something that you need? If you can synchronize your data locally, is that something you want to look at as well? There is this idea of a hybrid environment that seems to be talked about a lot, but not implemented very often, where you'd have some of your data or most of your data in the cloud, but there's certain pieces that either you aren't comfortable or you're not allowed to store in the cloud, so you'd still have an an on-prem environment for that as well. So it's managing that expectation to see what that looks like. Is that easy to implement? And how, what's that look like for an end user trying to access a document from both places? Is that easy for them? And then looking at, in your choice for going to the cloud, what's the roadmap for the solution provider that you've chosen? Are they looking at future technologies? Right now, if for firms that are, back 10, 15 years ago, the question was, do you have a DMS? Now it's, what DMS do you have? And then you're taking the next step into, what are you doing for process management? What about KM? What about records management? Everything else around your data that is being managed. Security is a big concern. With the cloud, you've probably seen some of the details of how secure it is. You probably had some crazy scenarios and questionnaires that you've had to fill out, or you've passed to your vendor to fill out to talk about security and encryption and all the standards that you are requiring for your clients. So it's making sure that is in place and that you're looking at where it's going in the future. people think about security as, you know, external hackers coming in. What about internal bad actors? So that's the other side of it as well. Is there safeguards in place to prevent somebody from taking your data and sharing it, you know, in a negative manner? So looking at those types of systems, are they available? Is it something you have to bolt on as a third-party product, or is it natively available in the suite? And then looking at connectivity between those different systems. Do you need a master account that has, you know, global access to everything in both systems? That could be a possible point of failure somewhere. So overall, you're looking at this as a 10 to 15 year investment. You really don't want to be implementing one document management system and then a year or two later going and putting it somewhere else. That is a whole lot of work that probably I wouldn't recommend anybody try. You're basically just spinning your wheels going somewhere. So if you're making an investment, you should be looking at least a 5-year ROI, and then looking at, you know, keeping that going forward. So from what we've seen, it's typically 10 to 15 years you want to be planning for, and then seeing what's next. What's the roadmap? Is this technology going where our firm is going? And is it going to be available to give us the things that we need wherever that future may bring? Artificial intelligence is a big thing. Is that part of it? Is there an option for some intelligence piece so that you're not just looking at, you know, searching for documents in your data? You want to search for information, and you want it to make up information. Is that available in there as well? So looking at all the solutions available and seeing what the roadmap is. I think that is the basic part of living in the cloud. So we covered preparing you for the cloud, all the things you might want to look at even now. Some firms have looked at getting a cloud readiness audit, or just someone to come and look over and say, well, when you are looking at moving to the cloud, here's a couple things you should consider. Never too early to start something like that, even if you haven't got full go-ahead to go to the cloud. That might be a consideration for some firms who say, well, we'd like to go, but what's it going to cost? How much work do we have to do? If this is going to be a massive process, then maybe we'll have to budget that for another year. So just scheduling that in there, planning that all out, seeing the big picture. Then we talked about moving your data. Actually, what happens when it comes time to actually start lifting your data up to the cloud and having it managed in there? How does that take place? Who manages that? Who's in control of those timelines? And then once you're there, how you can maintain your level of expectations that you have now and hopefully exceed them. Just again, showing a slide here about our experience with this. We've worked with, again, we have over 10 different firms we've worked now with in the cloud, many more coming on board right now. This seems to be a huge trend that we're seeing lots of people jumping on board with. We have lots of clients that are having positive experiences. We have a couple on the screen now, including the CEO from iManage, who's we've worked with extensively on some of these items. So we will take some questions now. Anybody has questions for us directly that they don't want to add in the Q&A, you can email us at info@rbrosolutions.com. We'll look at the Q&A, and I will open it up to see if we have questions that we've already had asked here. So right now I'm joined by Trevor Bell, our consulting director, who's going to help us assist with some of these questions here. Yep.
So we have 3 questions right now on the question and answer. So the first one was, what are some of the limitations around cloud versus on-prem? John spoke of quite a few of them during his presentation here. Ultimately, there's a couple that come to mind when I think about cloud as as it's offered as a software as a service. I think about the back-end access to the data layer. I think John touched on that as well. The SQL layer within the software as a service model is generally tightly controlled. And so some IT individuals are pretty reliant on SQL to gather and analyze the data within their company or firm. And this option is cut off when you move to the cloud. And it's more about supporting a low-touch infrastructure versus having this back-end reporting capability through the SQL layer. Many cloud offerings work very diligently to find out what reports clients need, and they're always growing to offer more and better reports. But this is one thing that comes to mind from a limitation perspective, at least from an IT point of view. There are solutions out there that do offer a workaround to this challenge, so just keep that in mind. This is a limitation that can be offset through various different solutions. I also mentioned in the response that sometimes flexibility of integration can be impacted as well. There are companies and firms out there that I've engaged with that have a lot of integrations at the data layer as well, or through proprietary capabilities. And once you're up in the cloud, you really need to go through the API, which is not actually a bad thing. So from RBRO's perspective, focusing on the API and providing integrations through the API should always be your first course of action. But that's just to say that some people don't always do that. And of course, you would need to go through the API. So some things need to be adjusted as well. So those are a couple of the items that we would see as limitations, but definitely not to the point where they would negate or outweigh the benefits. Another question was around the WAN are there WAN optimizations in the cloud offering? So this, again, if we're speaking from an iManage perspective, they do have performance throughput analytics to make sure that we are within the performance standards as expected from the on-prem or better. WAN optimization options for them, I'm not entirely sure if they've put any in place for smaller firms, but I do know that there have been efforts made in larger firms to do elements of that. Certainly, as I say, from the performance perspective, the cloud offerings that we've implemented for iManage, we obviously see better than on-prem performance in many cases. And so it really depends on if that's required for yourself or not. In some jurisdictions or countries/regions, the latency on the internet is pretty bad, where the majority of the firm can be moved to the cloud because the infrastructure supports it. Sometimes a hybrid cloud model needs to be introduced to support those very, I'm not sure what the right term is, but the internet's not so great where they are. So definitely having a hybrid model is a possibility within the iManage sphere. As it relates to cloud in general, we've worked with other hosted environments where they do offer cloud from a DMS perspective. And we've seen, MPLS circuits get put in place for those clouds to increase throughput, to decrease latency. And also sometimes they'll put in a caching server as well to address that. So hopefully I've answered that good, but you can get more information on that if necessary. And the last one that I have here on the docket is, does iManage share their disaster recovery plan? Specifically, iManage has within their documentation how they facilitate disaster recovery or mitigate any opportunity for downtime, and it's freely shared within their cloud guides as well as their online material. Essentially what they do is they have a fully redundant system that is self-healing. So when a node goes down, you are automatically redirected to another node. And if the nodes in one site or data center go down, then you are automatically redirected to the other data center that also hosts the mirror copy of your node. So there theoretically is not supposed to be any downtime when it comes to a disaster as it relates to the disparate data centers. And iManage is very open about that policy and that strategy. So if there are any other questions about that, RBRO can address those specifically or through iManage.
I think that was the last question that we had there. If anybody's thinking of anything now or they want to contact us directly, you can feel free to do that. You can contact us at info@rbrosolutions.com. I want to thank Ilta and Marcia for helping us out with this presentation. I hope it's been informative for you, and best of luck in your cloud endeavors in the future. Thanks.